I break the wax seal of a record that should not exist. The leather is dry. The ink smells of ancient dust and forgotten sulfur. This is the chronicle of a planet that tried to commit suicide by fire 56 million years ago. The date marks the beginning of the Eocene. I look at the map of the North. Today, it is a white void, a frozen desert where the wind screams at 80 degrees below zero. But this record tells a different story, a story of a summer night that never ends. Imagine standing at the North Pole. The sun is a relentless copper eye. It hangs in the sky, refusing to sink. It circles the horizon like a predator stalking its prey. But you are not shivering. You are suffocating. The air is thick enough to chew. It is a heavy, velvet curtain of humidity. The temperature of the water at the pole is 23 degrees Celsius, 74 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the temperature of a heated swimming pool in the middle of a frozen graveyard. There is no ice. There is no white. There is only a deep emerald green. You can hear the rhythmic clicking of insects. The water of the Arctic Ocean is fresh on the surface. It ripples under the weight of giant lily pads. Massive turtles, the size of dinner tables, bask on logs. The fossil record from Ellesmere Island confirms this nightmare. According to the University of Colorado Boulder, we found the remains of tapirs and primates, creatures that belong in the Amazon, living at the top of the world. I run my hand over the sketches of the Champsosaurus. It was a crocodile-like beast that patrolled these northern swamps. It lived in a world where the carbon dioxide levels were over 1,000 parts per million. The Earth was a greenhouse with the windows welded shut. The heat was of physical weight. It pressed against the ribs. It slowed the heartbeat. The silence of the Arctic forest is terrifying. The trees are not pines. They are dawn redwoods. Their roots drink from a soil that never freezes. But there is a price for this tropical paradise. The oxygen is heavy. The storms are monsters of steam and lightning. Nature is pushing the limits of what biology can endure. This was not a garden. It was a pressure cooker. Deep beneath the waves, the chemistry of the ocean is changing. The methane is beginning to stir. The world is about to choke on its own breath. I turn the page. The heat was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The Arctic was a trap, and the planet was about to find an unlikely savior. A tiny floating weed. A plant so small it fits on a fingernail. The Azolla, the silent assassin of the heat. Sources: Integrated Ocean Drilling Program. Nature Geoscience, University of Colorado Boulder. Alfred Wegener Institute. The heat was a suffocating blanket that refused to lift. The year is 50 million years ago. The world is a humid tomb where the sun never sets during the northern summer. I look at the core samples pulled from the Lomonosov Ridge by the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program. They are dark, they are rich. They tell a story of a silent invasion. The Arctic Ocean was nearly landlocked back then. A giant, stagnant bathtub of warm, fresh water sitting atop a layer of salt. It was the perfect cradle for a biological monster, the Azolla fern. It is no larger than a penny. It has no roots that touch the earth. It simply floats. But do not let its fragility deceive you. This plant is a master of rapid expansion. Under the right conditions, its population doubles in just 2 days. According to researchers from Utrecht University, the Arctic surface became a solid carpet of green. An emerald skin stretched across the top of the world. It looked like a meadow, but beneath that meadow was a graveyard. The Azolla breathed in the carbon dioxide that made the world a furnace. It locked that carbon into its tiny leafy body. When the plants died, they sank into the oxygen-starved depths of the basin. They did not rot. They did not release their carbon back into the sky. They became a vault. For 800,000 years, this cycle repeated. A relentless, microscopic vacuum cleaning the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide levels were staggering, 3,500 parts per million. The Azolla cut that number in half. I can almost feel the phantom chill creeping into the fossil record. The world began to gasp. The greenhouse was losing its glass. The heat that had sustained the crocodiles and the palm trees was leaking into space. This tiny weed was single-handedly dragging the planet toward a freezer. It was the greatest carbon sequestration event in the history of the Cenozoic era. The Integrated Ocean Drilling Program found layers of these plants 8 meters thick, 26 feet of compressed ancient life. The Azolla Event was a biological coup d'etat. Nature had found a way to break the fever. But the cure was as violent as the disease. The transition from a tropical world to an icy one was about to begin, and the creatures of the north were not prepared for the dark. The emerald green was destined to turn into a blinding, lethal white. Sources: Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302, Nature Geoscience, Utrecht University, Alfred Wegener Institute. The atmosphere 49 million years ago was a thick, invisible wall of pressure. Carbon dioxide levels had surged past 1,600 parts per million. To put that in perspective, our modern world shudders at the mention of 420. The Eocene Earth was a planet on the verge of a total thermal runaway. I imagine standing on the shores of what we now call the Arctic Ocean during that era. There was no white horizon. There was no wind to cut through the oppressive, stagnant humidity. The water was the temperature of a warm bath, often reaching 23 degrees Celsius. It felt like a world designed by a fever. Paleontologists from the University of Colorado have unearthed fossils of tapirs and crocodiles in the high Arctic. These are creatures that require year-round warmth to survive. They were thriving in a place where today only the most specialized predators can endure the freeze. The planet was a global hothouse, a seamless emerald jungle stretching from pole to pole. But this abundance carried a silent, existential threat. The greenhouse monster was not a creature of flesh and bone. It was the very air itself, trapping every calorie of solar radiation like a suffocating blanket. The heat was so intense that the oceans began to stratify in a lethal way. The layers of water stopped mixing, cutting off the circulation of life-giving gases. The depths became stagnant, hungry, and completely devoid of oxygen. This was the stage set for the most improbable hero in the history of our world. A tiny floating fern named Azolla. It was a microscopic David facing a planetary Goliath. The Integrated Ocean Drilling Program, through Expedition 302, uncovered the truth buried beneath the Lomonosov Ridge. They pulled up cores of sediment that told the story of a silent green invasion. I can see the dark, organic bands in those ancient rocks. They represent millions of tons of carbon pulled directly from the sky. Each band is a testament to a billion tiny lives that inhaled the poison and died to keep it buried. The Azolla bloomed in numbers that defy human comprehension. It was an emerald tide that spanned hundreds of thousands of square miles across the Arctic basin. This plant was a biological machine, relentlessly scrubbing the atmosphere. But every breath the Azolla took was a death sentence for the tropical world. As the carbon levels began to drop, the greenhouse monster started to starve. The heat that had sustained the giant reptiles began to bleed back into the void of space. I can almost feel the first phantom chill creeping into the fossil record. The emerald green was slowly being strangled by its own success. The transition was not a gentle slide, but a radical shift in the chemistry of the Earth. As the Azolla sank to the bottom of the ocean, it took the heat of the world with it. We are looking at the most massive carbon sequestration event in the history of the Cenozoic era. Nature had found a way to break the fever, but the cure would change the face of the Earth forever. The age of the tropical poles was ending, and the age of ice was screaming to be born. Sources: Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302, Nature Geoscience, University of Colorado Boulder, Alfred Wegener Institute. Imagine a sea that has forgotten how to breathe. 49 million years ago, the Arctic was a prison of glass and rot. The land masses of the north had locked fingers, sealing the ocean away from the rest of the world. No tides surged here. No currents from the Atlantic could break the suffocating silence of this massive basin. I stand on the imaginary shore of that ancient world, and the air is thick with the scent of a stagnant swamp. It is a heavy, cloying smell of decay that stretches for thousands of miles. Scientists from the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program uncovered this chemical nightmare in the Lomonosov Ridge. They found that the water was split into two distinct warring layers. On the surface, a lens of fresh water from massive prehistoric rivers floated like an oily veil. Beneath it lay the heavy, salt-choked depths of the ancient Tethys remnants. The two layers never touched. The two layers never spoke. This was the Great Stratification, a physical barrier that choked the life out of the deep. The depths became a tomb of hydrogen sulfide, a gas that carries the stench of a million rotting eggs. In this abyss, oxygen was nothing more than a fading memory. If you were to sink into those waters, the silence would be absolute and terrifying. There were no fish to dart through the darkness. There were no scavengers to clean the ocean floor. Anything that died stayed perfect in its misery, preserved by the total absence of life. This stagnant giant was the perfect cradle for a planetary catastrophe. It was a biological trap, waiting for a single spark to change the chemistry of the Earth. The Alfred Wegener Institute confirms that this isolation was the mandatory prerequisite for what happened next. Without this eerie stillness, the Azolla plant could never have conquered the world. The Arctic was a vast black lung, holding its breath until it turned blue. The pressure of the carbon-heavy atmosphere was pushing against the surface of this motionless sea. The chemistry was primed for a revolution that no animal could survive. The planet was about to use this graveyard to suffocate its own heat. I can feel the tension in the geological record, a world balanced on the edge of a knife. The stagnant sea was not just a body of water. It was the engine of the coming ice. Sources: Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302, Nature Geoscience, Alfred Wegener Institute, University of Southampton Oceanography Department. The sky above the Eocene Arctic did not just rain. It wept with a ferocity that defies any modern comprehension. Monstrous river systems, the ancestral ghosts of the Ob and the Mackenzie, surged with the force of 1,000 Niagaras. These were not mere currents. They were liquid highways of sediment and melted continental ice. As these colossal volumes of fresh water poured into the landlocked basin, a strange physical phenomenon occurred. Physics dictated a separation that would seal the fate of the global climate. Fresh water is lighter, a delicate skin floating on the crushing density of the ancient brine. Imagine a layer of shimmering oil resting on a glass of dark, heavy wine. They occupied the same geographic space, but they inhabited different biological universes. The Integrated Ocean Drilling Program identifies this as a stratified sea, a world divided against itself. This lens of fresh water grew until it was several meters deep, a floating ocean atop an ocean. It became a thin, translucent veneer that stretched for millions of square kilometers. I imagine standing on the deck of a ghost ship in that silent, humid era. The surface would look glassy, almost eerily calm, reflecting a sky thick with the haze of greenhouse heat, but beneath that mirror lay a barrier as impenetrable as the walls of a steel vault. Oceanographers call this the halocline. It was a boundary made of salt, but it functioned as a boundary of destiny. The oxygen in the atmosphere could no longer reach the suffocating depths. The wind could no longer stir the heavy, salt-choked heart of the sea. The Arctic was being smothered by its own surface purity. This fresh water was the fragile layer, a biological stage built for a silent invader. It was a precarious sanctuary, a giant warm lake sitting atop a stagnant, dead abyss. Data from the University of Southampton reveals that this stratification was unnaturally stable. For thousands of years, the vertical mixing of the waters ceased entirely. The heat of the Eocene, reaching nearly 25 degrees Celsius at the poles, fueled this engine of isolation. The planet was building a greenhouse inside a liquid tomb. I can almost see the microscopic tension at the interface where the salt met the fresh. It was a chemical war zone where no life could cross from the bottom to the light. The stage was now perfectly set for a tiny green plant to perform a lethal, global miracle. The Arctic was no longer an ocean. It was a trap waiting for the first leaf to fall. Sources: Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302, Nature Geoscience, University of Southampton, Oceanography Department, Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research. And then it arrived. A tiny, fragile speck of green drifted into the heart of the northernmost sea. It was Azolla folliculoides, a plant no larger than the nail of your pinky finger. I look at this creature and see an insignificant traveler, bobbing on the glassy surface. But in the grand, terrifying architecture of deep time, this was the arrival of a world shifter. It did not come with the roar of a comet or the tectonic violence of a volcano. It arrived with the absolute silence of a falling leaf. Botanists from the University of Utrecht describe this species as a biological miracle of efficiency. It is a floating fern, delicate and soft to the touch, carrying a secret weapon within its microscopic cavities. Nested inside its leaves was a symbiotic partner, a cyanobacterium called Anabaena azollae. This bacterium is a master of the atmosphere. It possesses the rare ability to fix nitrogen directly from the air, turning it into fuel. While other plants in the ocean starved for nutrients, Azolla carried its own feast with it. The Arctic surface was now a vast, stagnant canvas of warm, nitrogen-poor fresh water. It was a paradise of isolation, waiting for a conqueror that didn't need the soil. The Eocene sun, shining for 24 hours a day during the long polar summer, provided a relentless engine of light. I can imagine the first colony taking root in the invisible tension of the water's surface. A single plant becomes 2 in less than 2 days. 2 become 4, 4 become 8. Within a week, a single survivor could spawn a carpet that stretches beyond the horizon. The water beneath began to vanish under a layer of velvet green. The Azolla Event, documented in the journal Nature, was beginning its million-year reign. This was not just a seasonal bloom. It was a slow-motion explosion of life. The eerie silence of the stagnant Arctic was being replaced by the soft, wet sound of a trillion leaves rubbing together. Every single one of those tiny, fingernail-sized plants was a carbon-capturing machine. They were breathing in the very greenhouse gases that kept the world hot. It was a green shadow creeping over the roof of the world, silent and unstoppable. I feel a sense of dread looking at that peaceful, green expanse, because I know that this beauty was a mask for a global theft. The scale of what was coming is almost impossible for the modern mind to grasp. A plant that you could crush between 2 fingers was preparing to rewrite the chemistry of the entire planet. It was the beginning of the end for the hothouse Earth. Sources: Nature, University of Utrecht Department of Biology, Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302, American Journal of Botany. The green carpet stretching across the Arctic was not just a collection of plants, it was a fleet of biological warships, each carrying a secret passenger. To understand the cooling of our world, we must look closer than the naked eye allows. I imagine myself shrinking, descending into the microscopic labyrinth of a single Azolla leaf. Inside these tiny, overlapping scales, there is a hidden chamber, a moist, protected sanctuary built for a single purpose. Living within this darkness is a creature far older than the dinosaurs. Meet Anabaena azollae. This is a cyanobacterium, a master of primordial alchemy. While the rest of the botanical world struggled to find food in the nutrient-poor waters of the Arctic, Azolla held the key to the vault. Nitrogen is the building block of life, the literal gasoline for growth. Most plants are beggars, waiting for nitrogen to dissolve in the soil or water. But Anabaena does not beg. It reaches into the very air we breathe and tears the nitrogen apart. Through a process known as nitrogen fixation, this bacterium converts atmospheric gas into liquid fuel. It is a biological weapon of mass production. This is the symbiotic weapon, a pact signed in the shadow of the Eocene sun. The plant provides the housing and the sugars. The bacteria provides the infinite ammunition for growth. I feel a chill realizing how this one tiny alliance changed the fate of every living soul today. The Arctic Ocean was nitrogen poor, a desert of blue water. In any other era, a plant bloom would have starved and died within weeks. But Azolla brought its own feast to the table. It did not need the ocean to provide, it only needed the sky. This allowed the fern to double its biomass every 48 hours. Every 2 days, the army grew twice as large. Every 4 days, it quadrupled. I can almost hear the soft, rhythmic clicking of a trillion cells dividing in the silence of the polar night. This wasn't just survival. It was a hostile takeover of the global carbon cycle. The Azolla leaf became a fortress, and the Anabaena was the engine room. Scientists at the University of Utrecht have marveled at this perfect cooperation. It is one of the most efficient symbioses ever recorded in the history of biology. This tiny hitchhiker allowed Azolla to ignore the natural limits of the earth. It gave the plant the power to grow until there was no more room to breathe. And as it grew, it began to pull the carbon out of the atmosphere like a giant green sponge. The Azolla Event was no longer a local phenomenon. It was a planetary heist fueled by a passenger that no one saw coming. The heat of the Eocene was about to meet its match in a microscopic factory. We are walking on the legacy of this ancient partnership every single day. The silence of the Arctic was the sound of a world beginning to freeze. Sources: Nature, American Journal of Botany, University of Utrecht, Department of Earth Sciences, Science. The air 49 million years ago was not the air we breathe today. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of heat and moisture. Carbon dioxide levels were skyrocketing toward 3,000 parts per million. To a human, the atmosphere would have felt like standing inside a pressurized greenhouse. But for a tiny fern, this was not a crisis. It was a gold mine. Imagine a world where the very air is made of fuel. The Azolla looked up at a sky thick with carbon and saw an infinite feast. While other plants struggled with the limits of soil, this fern had cracked the code of the universe. It had its bacterial engine providing nitrogen and the sky providing the carbon. The Arctic Ocean had become the world's largest petri dish. I can see the data from the University of Utrecht showing the sheer density of this growth. It was a biological explosion that defies modern comparison. This was the infinite buffet, where the resources for life were truly bottomless. The fern began to replicate with a speed that is mathematically terrifying. Every 48 hours, the biomass doubled. 1 square meter of green became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8. In the silence of the Eocene, you could almost hear the wet, rhythmic expansion of the carpet. It moved across the water like a slow-motion tidal wave of velvet green. This was no longer a plant. It was a living crust forming over the top of the world. The wind could no longer reach the surface of the Arctic Ocean. The waves were silenced by a layer of vegetation feet thick. Below the surface, the water turned dark and still. The Azolla was drinking the sky dry of its carbon. According to research from the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program, the sheer volume of organic matter produced is staggering. We are talking about billions of tons of carbon being pulled from the atmosphere every few centuries. The infinite buffet was actually a planetary-scale heist. The fern was stealing the heat of the world and burying it in the mud. Every new leaf was a tiny coffin for a carbon molecule. As the plant grew, the planet began to lose its fever. The very success of the Azolla was the beginning of the end for the tropical Arctic. It was eating the greenhouse effect out of existence. I feel a sense of dread looking at the scale of this takeover. A single organism had hijacked the thermostat of the entire Earth. The buffet was infinite, but the consequences would be eternal. The green monster was growing, and the world was about to catch a cold it would never recover from. Sources: Nature, University of Utrecht, Department of Earth Sciences, Paleoceanography and Paleoclimatology, Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302. Imagine looking down from the edge of space 49 million years ago. You would not see the sapphire blue of an open ocean at the top of the world. Instead, you would see a planet that had turned a bruised, velvet green. The Arctic Ocean was no longer a body of water. It had become a continental-scale meadow floating on the abyss, a green shroud stretching across 4 million square miles of the northern hemisphere. This was the great stillness. The wind, once a sculptor of waves and a bringer of storms, was now a mere ghost rattling against a solid floor of leaves. The ocean still had a pulse, but it was buried under meters of living, breathing tissue. I stand at the edge of this imagined frontier and feel the weight of the silence. There are no whitecaps breaking the horizon. There is no salt spray biting at the air. The water is suffocating beneath the weight of its own success. According to the findings of the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302, this was not a temporary bloom. It was a permanent biological occupation that lasted for 800,000 years. The carpet was so dense and so thick that a prehistoric bird might have mistaken the sea for the shore. Every square inch of that emerald expanse was a biological machine working in overdrive. The Arctic had become the largest and most efficient carbon trap in the history of the Cenozoic era. It was a beautiful, mossy prison for the heat of the sun. Beneath the shroud, the water was losing its breath. Deprived of contact with the atmosphere, the depths became a stagnant graveyard of shadows. Above the surface, the sun beat down on a landscape that refused to give anything back. The Azolla was drinking every photon and every molecule of carbon dioxide it could reach. It was building a physical wall between the atmosphere and the abyss. This green skin was growing thicker with every passing season. We call it a shroud because that is exactly what it represented for the old world. It was the funeral cloth for the tropical Eocene. The planet was being wrapped in a living sheet of what would eventually become global ice. The green monster did not just inhabit the ocean, it owned the very rhythm of the Earth's heart. Sources: Nature, Paleoceanography, and Paleoclimatology, Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302. I leave the emerald surface behind and sink into the suffocating embrace of the deep. Down here, the light of the sun does not just fade. It is strangled by the sheer density of the living ceiling above. The water turns from a vibrant tea color to a bruised purple, and finally to a total, absolute black. I feel the pressure of the Arctic Ocean pressing against the silence. This is the beginning of the great anoxic trap. In a healthy ocean, the waves act as lungs. They churn the surface and pull life-giving oxygen down into the abyss. But the Azolla carpet has paralyzed the lungs of the Arctic. The water column has become a stagnant, layered cake of death. Fresh water from the continental rivers floats on top, trapped by the roots of the ferns. The heavy, salty brine of the deep sits motionless at the bottom. These two worlds no longer speak to each other. There is no circulation. There is no breath. Beneath the 50-meter mark, the oxygen levels drop to zero. I move through a realm where no fish can swim and no crustacean can crawl. It is a liquid desert where time has simply stopped. Every second, a silent rain of dead Azolla drifts down from the surface. It looks like ghostly flakes of brown snow falling through the darkness. In any other ocean, this organic matter would be a feast for scavengers. Bacteria would swarm and break the plants down, releasing their carbon back into the world. But here, the scavengers are dead. The microbes that require oxygen have been evicted by the void. The dead plants settle on the seafloor in perfect, undisturbed layers. They do not rot. They do not vanish. They are being entombed in a vault of cold silt. The earth is taking its own breath and burying it in a basement of mud. Every leaf of Azolla represents a tiny packet of carbon dioxide snatched from the sky. By preventing decay, the anoxic trap ensures that this carbon never returns to the atmosphere. It is a one-way door to the underworld. The Integrated Ocean Drilling Program found these layers were meters thick. Each millimeter represents a season of stolen heat. The Arctic was essentially vacuuming the greenhouse gases out of the sky and locking them in a tomb. This is why the cooling was so violent and so permanent. The planet was hiding its fuel source in the dark. I realize that I am standing over the greatest carbon cemetery in the history of the world. The silence here is the sound of a climate being dismantled. The anoxic trap was the mechanism that turned a tropical paradise into a frozen wasteland. It was not a slow leak. It was a geological heist. The stolen carbon would eventually transform into the massive oil and gas deposits we hunt for today. But 49 million years ago, it was simply a weapon of mass cooling. The Arctic floor became a black mirror reflecting the end of the Eocene. The trap was set, and the heat of the world had no way out. Sources: Nature, Science, Paleoceanography, and Paleoclimatology. The carbon siphon is not a machine built of steel and gears. It is a trillion tiny deaths occurring every single hour. Imagine each microscopic leaf as a biological lung that inhaled the sky and then died before it could ever exhale. I look at the dark, still waters of the ancient Arctic and feel the weight of a theft occurring in real time. 49 million years ago, the atmosphere was a thick, suffocating blanket of carbon dioxide. The heat was a physical presence that pushed against the skin of every living thing. But the Azolla plant had developed a terrifying, quiet efficiency. It became a biological vacuum cleaner with a hunger that could not be satisfied. Every green frond captured a molecule of carbon from the heavy heavens above. When that leaf reached the end of its life, it began a slow, agonizing descent into the absolute blackness of the abyss. In a healthy ocean, that carbon would have been recycled and breathed back into the world. But the anoxic trap at the bottom of the Lomonosov Ridge acted like a heavy vault door. The carbon was swallowed by the cold silt and held there with a grip that would last for eons. This was the birth of the siphon. A relentless, silent process of atmospheric drainage that lasted for 800,000 years. The Integrated Ocean Drilling Program revealed that this was not a localized accident. It was a planetary-scale operation of sequestration. The Arctic was literally peeling away the insulation of the Earth, layer by layer. Each millimeter of mud on that prehistoric seafloor is a ledger of stolen warmth. It is a record of how the world slowly lost its fever through a billion tiny burials. I can almost hear the atmosphere thinning as the greenhouse effect is bled out through the ocean floor. This is the most effective burial in the history of our planet. The Azolla did not just exist in the water, it fundamentally reorganized the chemistry of the globe. One microscopic piece of the sky at a time, the heat was being dragged into the mud. We identify this today as the great sequestration of the Middle Eocene, but for the creatures of that era, it was a silent death sentence written in shades of green. The siphon was wide open, and the warmth of the world was running out. Every falling leaf was a nail in the coffin of the tropical Arctic. The abyss was filling up with the ghost of the atmosphere. The heist of the Cenozoic was complete. Sources: Nature, Science, the Azolla Foundation. Imagine a war that lasts for 800,000 years. No generals led these armies. No steel was forged for this conquest. This was a biological siege of a planet, a relentless occupation of the entire Arctic Ocean. When we look at the sediment cores from the Lomonosov Ridge, we see the evidence: 800,000 years of uninterrupted emerald growth. Think about that duration: 80 centuries of centuries. Modern human civilization has barely existed for 10,000 years. This event lasted 80 times longer than our entire recorded history. It was not a seasonal bloom that faded with the wind. It was a permanent, suffocating blanket. The Azolla did not just visit the Arctic, it claimed it. I look at the core samples, and I see the terrifying consistency. Layer upon layer of fossilized fronds. Each millimeter of dark mud represents a millennium of theft. The heist of the atmosphere was a marathon, not a sprint. The plant was a biological machine designed for one purpose: expansion. In ideal conditions, this tiny fern can double its biomass in less than 2 days. Now, multiply that explosive growth by 800,000 years. The sheer volume of life produced is beyond our ability to visualize. The Arctic was a factory of carbon burial that never stopped for a single shift. This was the great siege of the Middle Eocene. The atmosphere was the enemy, and the Azolla was the slow-moving conqueror. Scientists at the University of Utrecht and the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program were stunned by this longevity. Nature describes a world where the freshwater cap never broke. For nearly 1 million years, the rains were heavy enough to keep the salt at bay. For nearly 1 million years, the heat was high enough to keep the water liquid. The plant exploited this window of time with a persistence that feels almost sentient. Every morning for 800,000 years, the sun rose over a green sea. The silence must have been absolute. Just the soft rustle of trillions of leaves rubbing against one another. The air was thick, heavy with the carbon that the plants were hungry to eat. But as the centuries turned into millennia, the air began to change. The siege was working. The greenhouse world was being dismantled, one leaf at a time. This was the longest-running climate engineering project in the history of the Earth, and it was performed by a plant no larger than a thumbnail. The persistence of the Azolla Event is what makes it a planetary titan. It stayed until the job was done. It stayed until the fever of the planet finally broke. According to the Azolla Foundation, this duration is what allowed the SO2 levels to drop from 3,000 parts per million to below 1,000. The siege ended only when the world was no longer recognizable. By the time the Azolla vanished, the Arctic was prepared for its first coat of ice. The war was over. The plants had won, and the warmth of the world was buried beneath the floor of the deep. Sources: Nature, Science, the Azolla Foundation. I stand on the steel deck of an icebreaker, surrounded by a white void that feels like the end of the world. The wind howls across the Lomonosov Ridge with a frequency that sounds like a warning from the deep. Below my feet, beneath 4,000 meters of freezing seawater, lies a mountain range that has seen the rise and fall of empires. In the year 2004, the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program set out to do the impossible. They were looking for a ghost. They were looking for the physical proof of a planetary transformation. The drill bit screamed as it pierced the seabed. It was a needle plunging into the skin of a sleeping giant. The scientists on board, led by visionaries like Henk Brinkhuis, waited in a silence that felt heavy. When the first core samples finally emerged from the dark, the atmosphere on the ship changed. It was not just mud. It was not just sand or silt. What they pulled from the depths was a black, oily, and dense substance. It was a graveyard. As they sliced into the sediment, the smell of the Eocene era filled the laboratory. It was the scent of ancient life, preserved in a vacuum for 49 million years. 8 meters of solid Azolla fossils. Think about that number. 8 meters of plant matter stacked millimeter by millimeter. Every single inch represented centuries of a world we can barely imagine. According to the report published in Nature in 2006, this was the smoking gun. The fossils were so perfectly preserved that you could still see the delicate structure of the leaves. They looked as if they had been plucked from a pond only yesterday. But these plants died when the North Pole was as warm as a tropical lagoon. The Lomonosov Ridge had acted as a monumental mausoleum. It held the record of the greatest carbon heist in history. I look at the data from the University of Utrecht, and I feel a chill that the Arctic wind cannot match. This was not a theory anymore. This was a physical reality that you could touch with your hands. The sheer volume of the Azolla mat was so vast, it defied conventional geological logic. The drill had moved through layer after layer of endless green history. This moosh was the evidence of a plant that had conquered an entire ocean. It was the evidence of a biological machine that had broken the back of a global heat wave. The scientists realized they weren't just looking at fossils. They were looking at the engine of the Ice Age. The Lomonosov Ridge had whispered its secret. The Arctic was once a forest of floating ferns, and that forest is exactly why the world outside my cabin is now made of ice. The magnitude of this discovery shifted our understanding of how fragile the climate truly is. We found the record of the siege, and the mud of the deep ocean was the only witness left to tell the tale. Sources: Nature, Science, Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302. Henk Brinkhuis sat in his office at the University of Utrecht, staring at a set of numbers that defied human intuition. He was a geochemist, accustomed to the slow, grinding scales of geological time. But the data from the Lomonosov Ridge was telling a story of a heist so massive it bordered on the impossible. This was not just a biological event. It was the greatest atmospheric theft in the history of the world. Brinkhuis realized that the Azolla fern was not merely a passive resident of the Arctic. It was a biological pump of terrifying efficiency. The calculations showed that this tiny plant had stripped trillions of tons of carbon dioxide from the sky. Think of the weight of every mountain range you have ever seen. Now imagine that weight multiplied by 1,000 and pulled directly out of the air. Every single leaf of Azolla acted as a microscopic vacuum cleaner. It inhaled the carbon that kept the Eocene world warm. When the plant died, it did not rot and release that carbon back into the atmosphere. Because the Arctic depths were stagnant and lacked oxygen, the carbon was trapped. It was a one-way street to the bottom of the ocean. The Azolla mat acted like a conveyor belt, dragging the sky down into the mud. Brinkhuis and his team estimated that carbon dioxide levels plummeted from 3,000 parts per million to just 650. That is a reduction of 80% of the planet's primary greenhouse gas. The thermal shield of the Earth was being dismantled molecule by molecule. I try to imagine standing on a shore 49 million years ago and feeling the air change. It would have been a silent, invisible execution of the tropical world. The heat that had sustained palm trees at the North Pole for millions of years was being drained. The atmosphere was thinning, losing its ability to hold onto the sun's embrace. The sheer scale of this sequestration is almost impossible for the human mind to grasp. We are talking about enough carbon to fuel the entire industrial revolution several times over. The atmospheric theft was a slow-motion catastrophe for everything that thrived in the heat. The calculations by the University of Utrecht revealed a planet in the grip of a biological coup d'etat. This tiny floating weed had more power over the climate than any volcano or tectonic shift. It was starving the atmosphere of its lifeblood. And as the carbon sank into the dark abyss of the Arctic, the warmth of the world went with it. Sources: Nature. The Azolla Foundation, University of Utrecht Department of Earth Sciences. Every complex system has a structural limit where it can no longer support its own weight. For millions of years, The greenhouse Earth was an unbreakable fortress of humidity and stagnant heat. But now, the sheer mass of the carbon being stolen from the sky was pulling the foundation out from under the world. I can almost hear the atmosphere straining, like a massive bridge under a load it was never designed to carry. This was the exact moment the cosmic scale tipped toward the darkness of the cold. It was not a sudden explosion, but a deep, structural fatigue of the planetary climate itself. The researchers at the University of Utrecht described this transition as the definitive end of the Eocene equilibrium. 10 trillion tons of organic carbon were now locked away in the suffocating mud of the Arctic floor. To visualize that, imagine every single forest on Earth today being buried twice over in a single geological heartbeat. That is the volume of ancient life that was turned into a silent, frozen tomb. The thermal inertia that once protected the poles from the vacuum of space was rapidly evaporating. The warm currents that used to kiss the northern shores began to falter, lose their rhythm, and finally fade. As I examine the geochemical records, I see a world whose pulse was beginning to slow down. The greenhouse effect was no longer a protective shield for the biosphere. It had become a tattered, threadbare veil that could no longer keep the warmth from escaping. For the first time in an epoch, the winter did not just arrive as a visitor. It arrived as a conqueror that refused to leave. The sun's rays were no longer being trapped by a thick, heavy blanket of carbon dioxide. Instead, they bounced off the surface of the planet and bled back into the infinite void. The Earth was losing its vital heat to the universe at an uncontrollable, terrifying rate. This was the tipping point where the biological machine of a simple weed broke the back of the planetary furnace. Deep in the data published by the journal Nature, the oxygen isotopes tell a story of violent shifting. It is the chemical signature of a global ecosystem going into a state of profound thermal shock. The greenhouse Earth was not merely cooling down, it was being dismantled from the inside out. A new, harsher reality was being carved into the crust of the Earth by the sudden absence of carbon. The tropical paradise that had reigned for 50 million years was being evicted from the high latitudes. In its place, a heavy silence began to grow, a silence the world had forgotten how to hear. It was the sound of the very first microscopic ice crystals forming on a sea that had once been as warm as a bath. The physics of the planet had changed its mind about the future of life. There was no turning back now from the cold abyss that the Azolla had invited into our world. Sources: Nature, the Azolla Foundation, University of Utrecht Department of Earth Sciences, Science Daily, the Eocene-Oligocene transition. The atmosphere was no longer a fortress. For millions of years, the carbon dioxide had acted as a heavy, suffocating, yet protective insulation. But now, the tiny Azolla plant had stripped that thermal defense away from the bones of the world. I imagine the Earth in this moment as a grand cathedral with its heavy oak doors suddenly flung wide in the dead of night. The heat was not just dissipating into the clouds. It was being sucked out into the absolute zero of the freezing vacuum of the cosmos. Scientists from the University of Utrecht call this the critical tipping point. It was a thermal exodus of unimaginable proportions. The planetary furnace was failing. Imagine standing on the shores of the Arctic Ocean 49 million years ago. Only a few generations prior, the water was as warm as a tropical lagoon in the Caribbean. Now, a strange, biting sharpness begins to prick at your skin for the first time in an eternity. The wind has found a new, lethal edge. It is a razor made of thinning air and disappearing molecules. Every breath you take feels a fraction thinner and sharper than the one before it. The oppressive humidity that once fueled the giant fern forests is simply vanishing. The world is becoming dry, brittle, and terrifyingly clear. Visibility stretches for miles as the haze of the greenhouse effect evaporates. The sea is the planet's primary memory bank of heat, but even the vast oceans cannot withstand the systematic theft of their thermal energy. In the records extracted from deep Arctic sediment cores, we see the shift in oxygen isotopes. The data from the 2006 Arctic coring expedition is undeniable. The water molecules themselves were changing their physical behavior. The Arctic basin was transforming into a massive, stagnant trap for the coming cold. The once vibrant currents that carried warmth from the equator began to stall and sink. The great conveyor belt of global energy was breaking down. Link by link, the sun still shone with the same ancient intensity, but its gift was no longer being accepted or retained by the Earth. Without the carbon shroud, the golden light simply bounced off the surface and returned to the dark. It was a planetary rejection of life's essential fuel. The ground, which used to radiate warmth long after sunset, now grew cold within minutes of dusk. The nights became longer, not in hours, but in their lethal, silent intensity. This was the birth of the first true winter of the modern era. A heavy, oppressive silence began to settle over the high latitudes of the north. The insects, once a constant deafening drone in the swampy heat, fell still. The reptiles, dependent on the ambient warmth to move their blood, became sluggish, frozen statues. Life was being told to wait. Life was being told to adapt, or to face total erasure. The Azolla had won its invisible battle against the carbon, but the prize was a world turning to stone. I can almost hear the first crack of ice forming on a lake that had never known a frost. It is the sound of an epoch ending. The greenhouse Earth was dying, and the icehouse Earth was being born in the shadows. According to studies published in the journal Nature, this transition was the most violent climatic shift in 50 million years. The sheer speed of the cooling defies our previous understanding of geological time. We are looking at a world in the midst of a cardiac arrest. The warmth was the heartbeat, and the Azolla was the cold hand that stopped it. Deep in the mud of the ocean floor, the fossils of tropical plankton abruptly stop. They are replaced by species that thrive in the dark and the cold. The transition is as sharp as a knife edge in the stratigraphic record. There is no middle ground in the physics of a dying atmosphere. The vacuum of space is a hungry ghost, and it was finally feeding on the Earth's soul. Sources: Nature, the Arctic Coring Expedition, University of Utrecht Department of Earth Sciences, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Imagine the ocean not as a mere body of water, but as a vast liquid engine of heat distribution. For 50 million years, this engine ran on a high-octane fuel of carbon dioxide and tropical sunlight. The currents were the arteries of a feverish planet, pumping warmth from the equator to the very tips of the poles. But as the Azolla plant continued its silent, green heist of the atmosphere, the engine began to sputter. The physics of the deep are governed by a brutal and uncompromising logic. When the air grew thin and cold, the surface of the Arctic Ocean finally surrendered its grip on the sun's energy. I stand on the edge of this transition, feeling the shift in the very salt of the earth. The water at the surface began to cool, and in doing so, it became heavy. It became dense, gaining a gravity that it had not possessed for an eternity. The once still Arctic waters began to sink, plunging into the darkness of the abyss like a falling mountain. This was the birth of a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing cycle of thermal suicide. As the cold water sank, it pulled more water from the south to replace it. But this new water was already losing its heat to a sky that was no longer a blanket, but a vacuum. The great ocean conveyor belt was being rewired in real time. According to researchers from the University of Utrecht and the Arctic Coring Expedition, this change in circulation was a tipping point of no return. The ocean, once the planet's greatest reservoir of heat, was now becoming its most efficient cooling system. The currents that used to carry life-giving warmth were now being diverted and suppressed. They were being forced to turn back before they could reach the northern latitudes. The Arctic was being isolated, cut off from the rest of the world's warmth by a wall of its own making. The feedback loop was relentless. Less carbon led to cooler water, and cooler water led to a circulation that starved the poles of heat. I can feel the growing loneliness of the northern hemisphere as it drifted into a permanent chill. The warmth was being hoarded at the equator, unable to penetrate the new cold barriers of the sea. This was not a gradual change. It was a structural collapse of the global climate architecture. The ocean was no longer a friend to the forests of the north. It had become a silent assassin, carrying the cold into the deep and locking it away. The sheer volume of water involved in this shift is almost impossible to comprehend. Millions of cubic kilometers of water were changing their dance, moving to a slower, darker rhythm. Every degree the water lost made it more effective at stealing more warmth from the air. The planet was caught in a downward spiral, a mechanical failure of the biosphere that was fueled by its own success. The Azolla had triggered the mechanism, but the ocean was now the one turning the gears of the
Arctic
coming
Coring
ice
Expedition
age.
seeks to
Sources:
understand the
Nature,
paleoceanography
the
of
Arctic
this
Coring
desolate,
Expedition,
frozen
Paleoceanography
shoreline.
and Paleoclimatology Journal, Cambridge University Press, the Cenozoic Era. Imagine a world where the Arctic Circle smelled of blooming jasmine and damp, fertile earth. 50 million years ago, the North Pole was not a wasteland of bone-chilling ice, but a cathedral of emerald leaves. Massive dawn redwoods stretched toward a sun that hung suspended in a golden sky for months at a time. Ferns as tall as houses drank greedily from rivers that flowed as warm as a summer bath. But the Azolla had done its work with a silent, terrifying efficiency. The carbon dioxide blanket that had warmed the earth for eons was being stripped away. I stand in my mind amidst these ancient, swaying glades, and I can feel the first true bite of the coming frost. It is a sensation these prehistoric trees were never biologically prepared to endure. The humidity, once a thick and protective shroud, began to evaporate into a cold, indifferent vacuum. The tropical paradises of the high latitudes were being evicted from their own ancestral lands. Scientists from the Smithsonian and the University of Colorado have uncovered the physical evidence of this eviction in the fossil record. Palm fossils found in the high Arctic tell a story of a sudden, brutal betrayal by the climate. The leaves did not simply fall in a gentle autumn. They withered on the branch as the very cells of the jungle crystallized. The great green wall of the Eocene was not just leaning, it was structurally failing. Imagine the sound of 1,000,000 square miles of forest dying in a single synchronous heartbeat. It was not a roar of fire, but a dry, papery rustle that signaled the funeral of an entire ecosystem. The vibrant orchids and the heavy, moisture-laden air were being replaced by a sterile and biting wind. The soil, once a dark treasury of nutrients and warmth, began to lock into the first grip of permafrost. I watch as the colors drain from the landscape, shifting from deep malachite to a ghostly skeletal gray. This was the Great Wither, a biological collapse on a scale that defies human imagination. The rainforests were the pumping heart of the planet's moisture cycle, and that heart was beginning to skip beats. The cooling was no longer a distant phenomenon hidden in the deep trenches of the ocean. It was now a hungry ghost haunting the woods, turning sap into ice and life into stone. Every degree of heat lost was 100 miles of jungle turned into a graveyard of wood. The animals that had thrived in this greenhouse world found themselves strangers in a landscape of white. Their sanctuary, which had stood for millions of years, was rapidly becoming their tomb. The intricate complexity of Eocene life was being undone by the simple absence of a single molecule: carbon. The planet was exhaling its last warm breath, and the lungs of the earth were collapsing. In that deepening silence, I realized that paradise is never a permanent state. It is a fragile, temporary miracle. The death of the northern rainforests was the closing of the door on the world as it used to be. Sources: Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, University of Colorado Boulder, Geological Sciences, Journal of the Geological Society, Science Magazine. The giants did not know the word extinction, but they felt its icy fingers tightening around their throats. High in the prehistoric Arctic, the Coryphodon, a beast the size of a hippopotamus, stood amidst the shivering stumps of what was once a swamp. I can see the steam rising from its nostrils like the exhaust of a dying engine. The humid, sweltering paradise that had sustained its bloodline for millions of years was now a landscape of profound betrayal. The choice was binary: stay and become a frozen monument, or begin the long walk toward a sun that no longer felt warm. Imagine the earth trembling under the weight of 10,000 brontotheres. These thunder beasts, standing 8 feet at the shoulder, were the undisputed titans of the Eocene. They were built for the lush, endless buffet of the northern jungles, not the barren wastes. But the jungle was retreating, replaced by scrub, dust, and the haunting silence of the coming frost. I watch as the lead matriarch turns her gaze toward the southern horizon with ancient, heavy eyes. She carries the memory of warmth in her marrow, a biological compass pointing toward a fading equator. The migration of the giants was not a parade. It was a desperate, slow-motion retreat from a world turning white. Every mile they traveled south, the air grew marginally thicker, but the competition for food grew exponentially fiercer. They were refugees of a changing atmosphere, carrying the legacy of the greenhouse world into an uncertain gray future. The ground, once soft and forgiving, was now a jagged, frozen mosaic that cut into their thick, calloused pads. There was no map for this journey, only the ancestral urge to outrun the encroaching shadow of the North Pole. Behind them, the forests they left were being reclaimed by a new, colder, and more unforgiving order. The silence of the north was becoming absolute, as the birdsong died with the heat. Ahead, the unknown offered no guarantees of survival, only the slim possibility of another sunrise. They were the last of the great humid kings, forced to march until their hearts or the earth itself gave out. According to the American Museum of Natural History, the fossil record shows a massive southward shift in mammalian ranges during this transition. Studies published in Nature Geoscience confirm that as the Arctic cooled, the latitudinal gradients tightened like a noose. The giants were being squeezed out of their own world by a drop in temperature they could not comprehend. I feel the rhythm of their footfalls, a heavy, rhythmic thud that still echoes through the layers of the fossil record. It is the sound of a world in motion, fleeing from an enemy it cannot fight and cannot see. This was the great exodus of the Eocene, a pilgrimage driven by the fading of the light and the death of the green. Millions of tons of living flesh, moving in a desperate attempt to stay within the golden hour of the planet. But for many, the journey would end not in the warmth of the south, but in the dry dust of a changing continent. The giants were walking toward a horizon that was shrinking every single day, and the world they left behind would never see their like again. Sources: American Museum of Natural History, Nature Geoscience, Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, the Eocene-Oligocene transition. The great migrations of the land were merely a symptom of a deeper, silent revolution occurring in the dark waters of the north. While the giants fled the encroaching chill, the true architect of their demise was already hard at work. I look at the stratigraphic records from the Lomonosov Ridge, and the truth is written in layers of dark organic silt. It was not a mountain of fire or an impact from the stars that broke the back of the greenhouse world. It was a tiny, floating fern no larger than a human thumbnail. Azolla folliculoides was a biological anomaly, a simple plant with a devastating appetite for carbon. 49 million years ago, the Arctic Ocean was a landlocked basin, a giant, stagnant cauldron of trapped water. Heavy rains and massive river runoff created a layer of fresh water that floated atop the saltier, denser depths. This layer was a perfect, nutrient-rich cradle for a green plague. Imagine a carpet of emerald green stretching across 4 million square kilometers of the northern sea. This was not a forest of towering trunks, but a microscopic army that conquered the horizon. The Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302 confirmed that this bloom lasted for 800,000 years. I can almost smell the thick, sweet scent of rot and stagnant water rising from that prehistoric lake. The Azolla lived fast and died in staggering quantities, sinking into an oxygen-starved abyss where nothing could decompose it. As it fell, it took the world's carbon with it, locking it away in a tomb of mud and silence. According to research published in the journal Nature, this tiny plant pulled trillions of tons of carbon dioxide out of the sky. Atmospheric concentrations plummeted from 3,000 parts per million to less than 600 in a geological heartbeat. The planetary thermostat was being turned down by a weed that could fit in the palm of your hand. The hothouse era, which had reigned for over 200 million years, was being suffocated by its own biology. The heat that had sustained the palm trees of the Arctic was bleeding out into the vacuum of space. I feel a cold shiver when I realize how fragile our global equilibrium truly is. This was the birth of the ice house, the definitive transition to the world of permanent ice we recognize today. The feedback loops were relentless and unforgiving. As the carbon dropped, the poles began to lose their grip on the sun's warmth. The first seasonal frosts began to bite into the mud of the northern shores. The great Arctic pond began to crust over with thin, fragile sheets of glass. The green carpet was replaced by a white shroud that reflected the sun's energy back into the void. The Azolla Event was the moment the Earth decided it would no longer be a tropical paradise. It was the beginning of a long, slow slide into the grip of the glaciers. We are the children of this cooling, living in a world shaped by a plant that almost breathed the atmosphere to death. Sources: Integrated Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 302, Nature, Azolla and the Eocene Arctic Climate, Utrecht University, Department of Earth Sciences Research. The northern chill was more than a local change. It was a planetary ultimatum sent across the equator. I imagine the heat fleeing from the southern hemisphere like a panicked animal. While the Arctic was being strangled by the green carpet of Azolla, the southern continent of Antarctica still held onto the last remnants of a tropical dream. But the message from the north arrived through the deep, dark veins of the global ocean. The cooling triggered by the tiny plant in the north had set a series of invisible gears into motion. According to research from the British Antarctic Survey, the Earth's climate system is a single, interconnected organism. When the northern thermostat dropped, the southern ocean began to feel the first shivers of an impending extinction. I can see the vast forests of southern beech and ferns that once blanketed Antarctica. It was a world of life, vibrant and green, where ancestors of modern marsupials roamed beneath a sun that never quite set in summer. Yet, the atmosphere was thinning of its protective carbon blanket. The trillion tons of carbon dioxide sucked away by the Azolla left the southern sky vulnerable and cold. Geologists from Cambridge University have documented how the tectonic plates were also conspiring with the changing climate. South America and Australia were slowly drifting away, breaking their ancient umbilical cords with the southern giant. The opening of the Drake Passage was the final devastating click of a cosmic lock. As the continents separated, a monster was born in the water, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. This was a ring of frigid, high-speed water that began to whip around Antarctica like a frozen moat. It was a thermal barrier, a wall of liquid ice that forbade the warm currents of the tropics from ever touching the southern shores again. I feel the suffocating isolation of a continent being cut off from the heart of the world. The warmth was trapped in the north and the tropics, leaving the south to freeze in its own shadow. The first snows of the Eocene-Oligocene transition did not melt when the summer came. They stayed, pressing down with the weight of 1,000 winters, turning into blue, crystalline ice. The massive ice sheets began to grow, crawling out from the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains like a slow-motion white tide. The trees that had stood for millions of years were crushed under the advancing wall of frost. This was the Antarctic response, a direct consequence of the cooling that began with a single weed in an Arctic pond. The planet was no longer a greenhouse. It was becoming a bipolar fortress of ice. By 34 million years ago, the transition was nearly complete. The world had lost its balance, and the scales were tipping toward a permanent, shivering cold. I stand in awe of the sheer scale of this destruction, where an entire continent was buried alive under 2 miles of ice. We are witnessing the moment the modern map of the world was written in frost and silence. The Earth had chosen its path, and there was no turning back from the deep freeze. Sources: British Antarctic Survey. The Evolution of Antarctic Ice Sheets. Nature Geoscience. The Drake Passage Opening and Antarctic Glaciation. Science. Cenozoic Global Cooling and the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. The Great Cooling was not just a story of wind and ice. It was a story of a silent, monumental burial. As the trillions of Azolla ferns died, they did not simply rot away in the light of day. They sank into a tomb of stagnant, oxygen-free water at the bottom of the Arctic basin. Imagine a graveyard spanning nearly 4 million square kilometers. The floor of the Arctic Ocean became a vault for trillions of tiny green lives. I look down into the abyss of 49 million years ago and see a world being stored in the dark. Layer upon layer of biological matter began to accumulate in a thick, suffocating blanket. The pressure of the deep ocean and the weight of the sediment began to press down with a crushing force. This was not a loss of life. It was a profound transformation of matter. The Earth was taking the carbon it had stolen from the atmosphere and locking it in a deep subterranean bank. Deep beneath the seafloor, a slow, chemical alchemy began to take place over tens of millions of years. The intense heat of the Earth's core cooked these tiny ferns in their own organic juices. through the long, silent epochs of the Eocene and the Oligocene, the green turned to black. Solid life became a thick, viscous liquid trapped in the pores of ancient rock. The very organisms that once froze the planet are now the concentrated energy that fuels our modern world. We call this the Arctic Hydrocarbon Province. Experts from the United States Geological Survey estimate that nearly 1/4 of the world's undiscovered oil and gas lies in this frozen frontier. It is a treasure chest built entirely from the corpses of a climate-changing weed. There is a haunting, terrifying irony in this deep-sea vault. The same carbon that once cooled the Earth is now waiting for us to dig it up and release it back into the atmosphere. The silence of the Arctic floor hides a massive reservoir of ancient sunlight. I feel the weight of those millions of years pressing against my chest like a physical hand. Each drop of oil is a concentrated memory of a world that was once a lush, green swamp. The Azolla did not just change the weather of its own time. It became the fuel for the future that would eventually come searching for its remains. The treasure is buried deep under the very ice it helped create. It is a cycle of life, death, and energy that defies the scale of human comprehension. This is the ultimate legacy of the tiny fern that conquered an entire planet. The vault is sealed by miles of water and ice, but we have finally found the key. Sources: United States Geological Survey, Circumarctic Resource Appraisal, the Azolla Foundation, the Azolla Event, and the Arctic's Oil and Gas. Nature: the 2006 Arctic Coring Expedition results. I stand on the edge of a massive steel platform suspended over the freezing void of the Beaufort Sea. The wind screams across the metal grates with a hunger that feels personal. Below my feet, thousands of feet of reinforced steel pipe are piercing the heart of a prehistoric tomb. We have finally breached the vault that the tiny Azolla built 50 million years ago. The substance we are pulling from the dark earth is a pitch-black liquid, thick as blood and heavy with the weight of lost ages. There is a profound, almost sickening irony in the work being done here tonight. For 800,000 years, those microscopic green ferns labored in total, selfless silence. They pulled the invisible carbon poison from the sky, one molecule at a time. They transformed a humid greenhouse hell into the kingdom of ice and stability we have known for all of human history. They were the silent, unintended architects of the temperate world that allowed our species to thrive. Now, we are tearing open their magnificent vault and setting the prisoners free. Every gallon of oil we pump to the surface is a concentrated, liquid breath of the Eocene epoch. We are igniting the very carbon that the Earth sacrificed its warmth to bury. It takes only a fraction of a second for a combustion engine to undo 1,000 years of Azolla's meticulous work. I can smell the ancient rot and the sulfurous ghost of a world that was never meant to return to the surface. We are literally burning the history of our own planet to provide a few more hours of light. The massive drilling machines roar against the silence of the tundra, indifferent to the chemical debt they are reclaiming. Experts from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warn that we are reversing a cycle that took eons to perfect. The Azolla spent millions of years cooling the engine of the world so life could find a new path. We are now throwing all that sequestered cold back into the furnace of the 21st century. It feels like a fundamental betrayal of the very ground that supports our weight. The carbon that once fed a prehistoric fern in a tropical Arctic is now fueling a jet engine over the Atlantic. We are breathing the ghosts of plants that lived and died long before the first human thought was ever formed. The atmosphere is beginning to remember the stifling heat of its ancient past. The Arctic ice, the very shield the Azolla helped create, is the first thing to succumb to this returned energy. It is a feedback loop of tragic, monumental proportions. We are using the energy of a dead world to systematically dismantle the foundations of our own. The irony is as cold as the deep water, and as dark as the viscous oil itself. We have found the key to the vault, but we have forgotten how to keep the door shut. The tiny fern saved the world once, but it cannot save us from what we are doing to its remains. Sources: Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere. The Azolla Foundation. The Great Carbon Partition. Science Journal. Anthropogenic Reversal of the Geologic Carbon Cycle. We stare at the jagged peaks of volcanoes and believe we have seen the ultimate power of our planet. I have stood at the edge of massive craters, feeling the heat of the Earth's internal fire. It is easy to tremble before a mountain that can tear the sky open with ash and molten rock. But our eyes deceive us by focusing only on the colossal. The true masters of the Earth's thermostat do not roar or explode. They do not have pulses or voices. They are the microscopic architects of the atmosphere. 49 million years ago, the Arctic was a steaming, subtropical paradise. I can almost feel the humid, heavy air that once clung to the northernmost point of our world. There was no ice, no frost, and no white horizon. Then, a tiny, floating fern named Azolla began to bloom in the quiet, stagnant waters. It was barely the size of a fingernail. Individually, it was fragile and insignificant. But biology has a way of turning the infinitesimal into a weapon of planetary transformation. The Azolla multiplied until it formed a green carpet across millions of square kilometers. It breathed in the carbon dioxide that kept the world warm. It did this for 800,000 years without a single pause. Every tiny leaf was a biological pump, pulling the heat out of the sky and burying it in the deep mud. Scientists at Utrecht University and the Azolla Foundation have mapped this slow-motion cooling. The sheer weight of these plants stripped the atmosphere of its greenhouse shield. It was not a meteorite or a volcanic eruption that triggered the ice ages. It was the quiet, relentless growth of a microscopic weed. I look at the ice sheets today, and I see a tomb of green. Beneath miles of frozen water lies the evidence of this biological heist. The Earth is not just a rock governed by physics and orbital mechanics. It is a living organism where the smallest cell can override the largest mountain. We often forget that our current climate is a fragile gift from these ancient microbes. They spent eons tailoring the air so that we might one day breathe it. The scale of the small is the most terrifying power I have ever encountered, because if something so tiny can freeze a planet, we must ask what happens when we disrupt their labor. Sources: Utrecht University, the Azolla Project, Paleoceanography, Nature Journal, Episodic Fresh Surface Waters in the Eocene Arctic Ocean, the Azolla Foundation, Climate Change and the Arctic Fern, NASA Earth Observatory, The Power of Phytoplankton. Imagine a machine built entirely of water and sunlight. It does not roar like a waking volcano. It does not crack the crust of the Earth like a tectonic shift. Instead, it breathes. 55 million years ago, the Arctic was a closed, stagnant basin. I can visualize it as a giant, warm bathtub filled with fresh water floating atop the salt. And within this bathtub, the Azolla fern found its perfect foundry. It formed a secret, microscopic partnership with a bacterium called Anabaena. This was the ultimate biological hack. While other plants struggled for nutrients, the Azolla reached into the sky and pulled down nitrogen directly from the air. It was an infinite energy loop. I stand in my mind on those ancient shores and feel the oppressive weight of that green carpet. It was so thick you could almost imagine walking across the North Pole. But this beauty was a silent executioner of the ancient, tropical world. For 800,000 years, this mat of green acted as a massive planetary sponge. It inhaled trillions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere. When the plants died, they did not rot and release their gas back into the sky. The stagnant, oxygen-poor depths of the Arctic Ocean turned into a graveyard of organic matter. The carbon was locked away in the black mud, chained to the seafloor for eternity. According to research from the University of Southampton and the journal Nature, this single event plummeted carbon dioxide levels by nearly half. The thermostat of the entire world was being turned down by a thumb made of moss. The greenhouse Earth was dying in the silence of a swamp. The icehouse Earth was being born, one tiny leaf at a time. It is a chilling realization that the very ground we walk on is a ledger of ancient chemical warfare. We often talk about saving the planet as if the Earth is a helpless victim. In reality, the Earth is a brutal architect that uses life as its primary building material. The Azolla did not intend to freeze the world or kill the subtropical paradise. It simply grew until it choked the heat out of the sky. Nature does not negotiate and it does not seek balance for our sake. It only reacts to the cold, hard logic of biology. Sources: Nature Journal, Cenozoic Central Arctic Ocean Sub-Bottom Depths and Carbon Sequestration, University of Southampton, the Azolla Event and the Eocene-Oligocene Transition, the Azolla Foundation, the nitrogen-fixing symbiosis of Anabaena azolae. Science magazine, the Arctic greenhouse to icehouse transition. I want you to imagine a drill bit descending through 4 kilometers of dark, frigid water. It bites into the soft, ancient flesh of the Arctic seafloor. When that steel pipe is pulled back to the surface, it carries a cylinder of mud that smells like rotten eggs and forgotten time. This is a sediment core. To a geologist, this is not just dirt. It is a barcode printed in the language of catastrophe. The scientists of the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program looked at these layers and saw something that should not exist. Beneath the ice-scoured gravel of the modern age, they found a layer of black, organic silk. It is the physical remain of the Azolla. This thin, dark line in the strata is a tombstone for a tropical world. It proves that the transition from a hot planet to a frozen one was not a slow, gentle slope. It was a cliff. According to researchers at the Alfred Wegener Institute, this record shows a planet losing its grip on stability. I have seen the high-resolution scans of these cores. They are haunting. You can see the exact moment when the carbon stopped circulating and started sinking. In the layers below, the Earth was a humid, feverish paradise. In the layers above, it is a graveyard of frost. The warning written in this stone is absolute. Once the biological trigger is pulled, the geological response is irreversible. The Azolla did not ask for permission to change the world. It simply followed the laws of its own hunger. And in doing so, it locked the heat of the Eocene away in a vault of black mud. We often believe that the Earth will always find a way to return to a state that favors us. The Azolla Event screams the opposite truth. The planet does not care about our comfort or our survival. It only cares about the balance of its own chemistry. When the atmospheric carbon dropped from 3,000 parts per million to 600, the world snapped. The palm trees of the north did not wither slowly. They were erased by a shift in the very physics of the air. The University of Utrecht suggests that this carbon sequestration was so massive it created a permanent deficit. The heat could never come back. The Earth had entered a new, colder era that has lasted for 49 million years. I look at these graphs, and I feel the weight of deep time pressing against my chest. We are living in the tail end of a biological coup d'etat. Every glacier we see, every snowflake that falls, is a ghost of that tiny fern. It is a reminder that the strata never lie. They hold the evidence of how fragile the normal state of our world truly is. The message is clear. Once the chemistry of the sky is altered, the rocks remember forever. The silence of the Arctic ice is the final word in a debate that ended millions of years ago, and we are just the latest witnesses to the cold reality that remains. Sources: Integrated Ocean Drilling Program, Arctic Coring Expedition 302 Summary, Alfred Wegener Institute, The Cenozoic Cooling of the Arctic, University of Utrecht, Palynological Records of the Azolla Event, Nature Communications, Thresholds for Greenland Ice Sheet Stability. I stand on the edge of the present and look back at the long, slow work of the Azolla. It took nearly 1 million years for that tiny fern to drain the sky of its fire. 1 million years of quiet, patient breathing in the prehistoric silence. Every leaf was a microscopic lock, trapping carbon in a tomb of frozen silt. But today, the silence of the deep earth is being shattered by the roar of the machine. We have found the vault where the Eocene was buried, and we have brought a skeleton key made of fire and steel. What the planet spent an eternity cooling, we are reheating in the blink of a geological eye. The data from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is a chilling ledger of speed. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration confirms a reality that defies human imagination. We are not just shifting the climate. We are running the Azolla Event in reverse gear at a terrifying, unnatural velocity. The original cooling was a slow-motion miracle of biological sequestration. It removed carbon at a pace that allowed the world to drift and adapt over eras. Our modern engine does not drift, it screams. According to the latest records, we are injecting carbon back into the atmosphere thousands of times faster than the Azolla ever took it out. Imagine a clock that once took a millennium to tick just 1 second. Now, that same clock is spinning so fast the hands have become a blur of heat. That is the acceleration of the human era. I feel the heat of the exhaust and I smell the ghost of the ancient swamp. When we burn coal and oil, we are releasing the very sunlight that the Azolla trapped in the mud 50 million years ago. We are exhaling the breath of a world that has been dead since the dawn of the mammals. The atmosphere is thickening with the spirits of a lost jungle. It is a resurrection of a chemistry that hasn't existed since the Arctic was a steaming lagoon. This is not a prophecy or a distant warning from the stars. It is a physical displacement of energy on a scale that dwarfs the volcanic eruptions of old. The planet took 800,000 years to build the foundations of the ice caps. We are dismantling those foundations in less than 300 years. The weight of this reversal is a pressure that sits heavy in the lungs of the world. Sources: NASA. Climate change. How do we know? No AA. Climate change. Atmospheric carbon dioxide. Nature. Anthropogenic carbon release rate unprecedented during the past 66 million years. The Azolla Foundation. The Azolla Event. I look at the horizon and see a thread of light so thin it seems impossible. This is the Holocene. It is a brief golden hour in the life of a planet that has known only brutal extremes. For 11,700 years, the Earth has kept its temper. The storms stayed within their bounds, and the seasons arrived like clockwork. But this stability is not the sovereign rule of the universe. It is the rare and terrifying exception. The data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reveals that we are balanced on a razor. To our left lies the sweltering ghost of the Eocene, where crocodiles swam in a boiling Arctic. To our right lies the frozen silence of a world encased in kilometers of jagged ice. We exist in the fragile gap between a furnace and a freezer. I can feel the precariousness of our heartbeat in every single degree of warming. The geological record shows that Earth is a pendulum of fire and frost. The Azolla Event pushed that pendulum toward the cold with a slow green hand. Now, the hand of man is swinging that pendulum back with the force of 1,000,000 explosions. According to the Geological Society of London, we have exited the natural cycles of the last 2 million years. We are moving into an uncharted chemistry that the mammals of today have never witnessed. The silence of the deep past is being replaced by the roar of an accelerating engine. I touch the soil and realize it is a thin skin over a history of absolute chaos. The atmosphere that protects us is thinner than the peel of a bruised apple. Inside this skin, everything we have ever built depends on the planet staying still. But the planet has no intention of staying still for our convenience. Nature reveals that the climate is not a steady state, but a series of violent tipping points. We are leaning our entire weight against a door that has been locked for 50 million years. If that door swings open, the balance is shattered beyond any hope of repair. The weight of our daily actions is tipping the scales toward a destiny we are not built to survive. We are the children of a temporary window, and that window is closing with a thud. The oxygen we breathe and the water we drink are gifts from a peace treaty between giants. That treaty is being torn apart in real time by the chemistry of our own breath. I watch the ice melt, and I hear the sound of a clock running out of its final ticks. Sources: IPCC, Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, the Geological Society of London. What the geological record tells us about our present and future climate, Science magazine. A high-fidelity record of Earth's climate over the past 66 million years, National Geographic, the Holocene Epoch. I stand on the edge of a thought so vast it threatens to crush the human ego. We perceive ourselves as the architects of the atmosphere and the masters of the terrain. But the geological record reveals a silent and green rebellion that humbles our pride. 49 million years ago, the sun was an absolute tyrant over a sweltering planet. The Earth was a hothouse where palm trees swayed in the breeze of the North Pole. Crocodiles bathed in Arctic waters that remained as warm as a tropical bath. The planet was trapped in a fever that had lasted for tens of millions of years. Then, a microscopic protagonist emerged from the freshwater runoff of the continents. The Azolla fern is a tiny, delicate weed that floats on the surface of stagnant ponds. It possesses no brain, no heart, and no conscious intent to change the world. Yet, this insignificant plant began to challenge the thermal power of the sun itself. The Arctic Ocean was restricted then, a giant basin of trapped, still water. A layer of fresh water formed on the surface, creating a cradle for the green invader. In the span of 800,000 years, the Azolla bloomed in a carpet of endless emerald. It covered the entire Arctic Ocean, from the coast of Siberia to the edge of Greenland. This velvet layer of vegetation began to perform a miracle of chemical warfare. Every single leaf acted as a biological pump, pulling carbon dioxide directly from the sky. As the plants died, they sank into the oxygen-depleted depths of the sea. They did not rot, and they did not release their carbon back into the atmosphere. They became a tomb for the heat of the world, burying the sun's energy in the mud. The Geological Society of America confirms that atmospheric carbon plummeted by half. The Azolla Event pulled 3,000 gigatons of carbon from the air. The fever of the Eocene was broken by the weight of 1 trillion tiny leaves. This is the cosmic perspective that should cause your blood to run cold. The Earth is a self-regulating organism that does not require our permission to transform. It is a machine of biological feedback loops that can trigger a deep freeze to cure a fever. The pondweed proved that a single species can rewrite the destiny of the entire globe. It turned a tropical paradise into a kingdom of ice that has lasted for millions of years. We are witnessing the power of a living planet that balances itself with ruthless efficiency. The sun provides the fire, but the life upon the crust decides how that fire is used. We are not the first to change the chemistry of the air, and we will not be the last. The silence of the Azolla reminds us that the earth can breathe us out as easily as it breathed the fern in. Our survival depends on a thin ribbon of stability that the planet can snap at any moment. The scale of this power is monumental, ancient, and entirely indifferent to human history. We are merely passengers on a giant that is currently deciding its next move. Sources: nature. Episodic fresh surface waters in the Eocene Arctic Ocean. The Geological Society of America. The Azolla Story. Science. Cenozoic mean greenhouse gases and temperature. NASA Earth Observatory. The Azolla Event and global cooling. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of an icebreaker, surrounded by a jagged, blinding landscape of white. The wind howls with a primal violence that feels deeply personal. Below your feet, beneath 4,000 meters of crushing, frigid salt water, lies the Lomonosov Ridge. This is not merely a collection of sand and silt. This is the long-term memory of our planet. In the year 2004, the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program pierced this absolute darkness. They pulled a core of sediment from the seabed that felt like a holy relic of a lost world. Within those dark, layered cylinders, scientists discovered the silence of the Azolla. 50 million years have passed, yet these tiny ferns look as if they drifted to the bottom yesterday. They are frozen in a state of perfect chemical stasis. They hold within their delicate cellular walls the actual carbon atoms of the Eocene epoch. The very air that once nourished giant reptiles and ancient, long-extinct primates is trapped in these stones. It is the ghost of a world that was once lush, green, and suffocatingly hot. The North Pole was once a freshwater lake, and these ferns were its absolute masters. But they were also its unintentional executioners. Every single millimeter of that dark mud represents centuries of relentless carbon sequestration. The Earth did not ask for permission to change its fate. It simply utilized the smallest life forms to tame the largest climate crisis in history. We often walk the surface believing we are the architects of the atmosphere. But the Azolla legacy proves that we are merely a fleeting footnote in a much grander narrative. The ferns are still there, resting in the crushing pressure and absolute cold of the deep Arctic. They are both a warning and a testament to the planet's hidden power. They whisper that the Earth is capable of radical, violent, and indifferent transformation. The blueprint for the next great cooling or the next great warming is already written in the silt. If humanity were to vanish tomorrow, the sediments would continue their slow, rhythmic accumulation. The Earth would find a new biological pump, a new way to breathe, and a new way to break its fever. We are looking into a mirror of deep time, and the reflection is humbling. The silence of the Arctic is not empty or void of meaning. It is heavy with the physical weight of 350 trillion tons of sequestered history. The ghost of the ancient atmosphere waits in the dark, holding the secrets of our future in a stony, prehistoric grip. Sources: nature. Episodic fresh surface waters in the Eocene Arctic Ocean. the Geological Society of America, the Azolla Story, Science, Cenozoic Mean Greenhouse Gases and Temperature, NASA Earth Observatory, the Azolla Event and Global Cooling. Seal of Veracity, right fact, to confirm your understanding of the technical rigor and scientific foundation of this chronicle.